enable the teams to do the right work at the right times. At the same time, we want to defend ourselves, from certain things, bad actors, regulators, etc. So in the product side of the house at Yext, at ServiceNow, we talk about the benefits to begin with, and then we showcase what kind of models have we driven to support the case. This could be an enterprise security assessment at the highest level, or bring it down a notch and talk about threat modeling use cases that we came about. And then we kind of drive the discussion downwards.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOps community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down, fixing vulnerabilities in code, open source, containers, and infrastructure as code. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD. That's SNYK.io/TSD. On today's episode, Podjarny, founder of Snyk, talks to Rohit Parchuri, Chief Information Security Officer at Yext. Rohit is an accomplished security leader with an established record building, structuring, and institutionalizing security principles and disciplines in the cloud hosting, network hardware, cloud software, and healthcare domains. We hope you enjoyed their conversation, and don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Today, we have with us the VP and Chief Information Security Officer of Yext, Rohit Parchuri. Rohit, thanks for jumping onto the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Rohit, there's a lot. You're the CISO there at Yext, but we talked about all sorts of interesting conversations that we can have over here. But today, we're going to dig primarily into this notion of DevSecOps frameworks and how do you think about it? How do you think about it from a people perspective or such? And maybe we get a little bit into sort of measurement. Does that sound good? Ready to go?
That sounds perfect.
So before we dig in, can you please tell us a little bit about, what is it that you do today, and maybe a bit about the journey into security and to where you are today?
Sure, I would love to. So currently, like you just talked about, I'm the VP and Chief Information Security Officer at Yext, and this is my 5th month into the company. Still a little new, still trying to figure out or get my bearings in. But before this, and primarily I'm responsible for building the cybersecurity program and also GRC and privacy components within. The journey has been fantastic so far. I'm looking forward to all the great things that the company is going to do, and also how my role kind of fits into that. Before this, I was with a company called Collective Health. So a little bit of healthcare experience, and, it certainly was interesting. That was one challenge I wanted to take up on myself, and I'm super glad I did. Healthcare is completely a different domain. And when it comes to cybersecurity, it's just all over the place. So I'm sure we'll get into the, more specifics and details around that. I was there for maybe a little over a couple of years. And before that, I was with ServiceNow for about 8 years. So I started in systems and network security, and then made my way into app and product security, a little bit of security operations. But I was basically responsible in building a few teams and disciplines within ServiceNow before, when I felt, I was maybe being more jaded with the things that I've been doing, and I wanted to maybe take up a new challenge. That's when I shifted roles and took up a CISO role at Collective. You asked about the journey. For me, I think the cybersecurity concept itself dawned unconsciously, more so during my undergraduate degree. So my degree in undergraduate, as an undergraduate, was the electronics and communications. So I was not in a computer field, but I used to do a night college as well, which was more towards the software side of things. One, I was satisfying my family, the other is satisfying myself. So there was this project that we were working on the electronics domain, given that was the major. And we stumbled upon something called a rootkit. I'm sure everybody knows what a rootkit now is. But back in the day, this I was talking about in 95 days. Rootkit was pretty new back then and was very fancy and shiny thing to work on. And we stumbled upon it. I was really thrilled about how it could actually tamper the programs and manipulate the computer processes. And I was, pretty interested to look a little deeper into that. But my journey really began not more so from a threat standpoint, but more so how do I actually think about defending from something like this, happening to the victims or, people who are actually interacting with that unconsciously for the most part. So that's really how it began. And then I applied for a few universities to see if cybersecurity is even a thing or, is this some people just talk about it? Well, I soon figured it was actually a thing. And there were a few universities who were giving out the degrees. So, from then on, I took up that.
Got it. Very cool. Well, thanks for the reverse journey a little bit. There. I think you just need to get the bug at some point and then begin. So we're going to dig a bit more maybe into specifics of it, but you've kind of gone from a tech platform to a health platform. I guess also tech, but from in a different level of maybe regulations and such, and then into Yext, which probably resembles ServiceNow more in terms of its regulatory perspective. How is it a stark difference? I mean, how significant is it to change those worlds?
That's a great question. I think it is. I wouldn't have responded the way I'm doing right now if you asked me a couple of years ago, because I wasn't expecting that to be the case. Like I felt cybersecurity is a more common sense topic and people would actually embrace the concept and start working on that. But that's not really the case. And I'm sure, the listeners here, coming from the security background, you can relate to that. It's always a journey. There's a certain friction. You have to navigate the space, etc. But for me, the stark difference that really I was able to see is between the product delivery versus the healthcare delivery. So ServiceNow and Yext, product facing more on the product side of the house, whereas Collective Health is completely on the healthcare. And it also has to do with more the way I would like to think about the security programs within any healthcare space. It's more inside out than outside in. What I really mean by that is you're not really delivering a lot of features, or what I mean is security features or security enhancements per se, but you're managing your partners and vendor ecosystem a little more than you would typically do on the the product side of the house. The reason for that is healthcare has a number of antiquated processes and vendors we have to work with, and a lot of that work has to do with paper, physical paper. You would think at this day and age, you still have to deal with paper, which is absolutely true. You still have to deal with it. And the problem is there's a lot of PHI. Protected health information happens to be one of the most sensitive and confidential pieces of information that you can find in this country right now. And with that in mind, we're not only talking about the paper, but also how do you transform that, convert that into ePHI, electronic form of PHI. And then you have to have a program built around that. So you're capturing the physical aspect and the digital aspect of things, which is where it gets a little complicated, I felt. And more importantly, you're talking or you're partnering with, when I talked about antiquated, I'm not just talking about the processes themselves, but also talking about the mindset of the people. When we partner with these folks, they hardly know what a difference between a security versus something else is. A lot of people are still catching up to the digital world. A lot of people are still going through the migrations, from physical to a digital. So it's really difficult for us to even have a straight conversation about security, and let alone talk about the programs and maturity frameworks, things like that. That's never going to happen, right? That's a non-starter. So for me, that's a stressful place to be at. At the same time, I can say I learned a lot of things really about how do you build a culture, not just with the people who understand the concepts, with the people who don't understand the concepts, where you actually want to empower them with the right things. This is not in terms of tools, right? You are actually trying to build the mindset. The most difficult terrain you can find is a human mind landscape, right? So that was one of the biggest things where I found about how a technology firm operates versus a healthcare firm, for example.
No, I think there's definitely a lot there. For context, Collective Health itself is a more technology-driven company, right, in the healthcare industry. And a lot of those challenges, did you encounter them within Collective Health and kind of the reality they're in, or is it more about Collective Health's partners and customers and the ecosystem that was the challenge?
Yeah, and that's a great point you brought up. So Collective Health is a cloud-first microservices architecture, everything you can think about, how we operate our infrastructure applications at scale in this day and age. That's what Collective Health is. And they're pretty focused and, they have a great vision and how they want to build the products, that are of great use and benefit for the people. the problem or the friction that I've seen is not with the leaders or not with the company itself. The culture has been pretty strong, right? When you're in healthcare, HIPAA is, it's table stakes, right? HIPAA is something you have to do, and more. It's actually much easier for us to talk about GRC in a healthcare or a heavily regulated space than in a product space, for example. But the problem is more so, how do I take the HIPAA journey, for example, with my vendors and partners? That's the difficult part, which is when the external facing interactions happen.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess indeed, let's talk DevSecOps. Let's talk a little bit about how do you implement it. And it's, I think one of the great perspectives you have here is indeed the healthcare surrounding maybe and the X surrounding. But in both those cases, your own company, Yext and Collective Health, are kind of agile, DevOps, fast-moving companies. So how do you think when you talk about weaving security into development or into the activities? What are some of the core principles or approaches that you use, in such a, fast-moving pace? How do you tackle it?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. I will definitely start with that disclaimer. And there's no one size fits all. Like every fast-paced organization, every leading edge organization, for example, you have to start or lead with the why. Like, why are we even doing this in the first place? And then kind of assess the other attributes on how you want to build the program. But I'll talk about what worked for me, and maybe we can expand it from there. So there are a few key ingredients that I focus on when I'm, taking up the helm. Like when I come into a company and when I'm trying to assess what kind of cybersecurity program do I need to build, both from a culture standpoint and also from a staffing standpoint. So the ingredients I want to talk about is a culture. First and foremost, like, how do you build a culture or a security mindset across the company? Are you starting from ground zero, or did somebody else do the work for you? And are you starting at level 1, level 2, whatever that may be? But the culture is so important. I can't stress enough the importance of that. And a lot of people don't take that. And I definitely I'm not an exception to that. I've learned this the hard way myself. In order for you to have a successful program, a successful interaction, and influencing the people to take the right decisions from a cybersecurity standpoint, because that's what you're responsible for in a company, you need everybody rowing in the same direction. And culture plays a critical role in that. However, there are a combination of things too. You can't just focus on the culture. There's also automation, enforcement. When you establish the culture as the foundational principle, then you kind of, take that level up and say that, okay, this is how we want to define the practice within a company. And these are, the tools or the frameworks that we would enable for us to get things done at scale and also optimize as we go along. So I would start there, and maybe, depending on how we work as a company or what kind of direction are we taking from a product or a sales strategy, I would pivot and course correct as needed.
Are there specific frameworks that you start from? I mean, when you've kind of worn a similar hat in 3 companies now, are some go-to?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I wouldn't lie by saying that I start something my own, right? Because there are a lot of great frameworks and a lot of industry experts actually worked on that. So why reinvent the wheel when you already have a trove of information available? But the way, it's not so much about the framework, but the way I approach it is what I feel comfortable with the things that I do. And I'll talk about the frameworks in a minute, but I would delineate those two into a program level frameworks and a control frameworks. A program level framework for a CISO is so important. And even, for folks in the internal audit, is what kind of direction are we taking as a company when it comes to cybersecurity staffing, spend, the program objectives, etc. Right. So that's really setting the narrative or the dialogue to begin with. This is what I would use to talk to my board, talk to my executive team, figure out what kind of direction we need to take in terms of compliance certifications, regulatory, etc. The extension to that is what the control framework itself is. So the control frameworks are, how do you manifest the program framework into practice, right? So, simple things like, how do you build the security principles, the architecture, the principle of least privilege, architectural considerations, threat modeling, scanning, the whole gamut, right? And a few examples for me, in terms of program framework, Nest CSF has been super helpful. And I'm sure most of your listeners or, folks in cybersecurity attest to that. It's It's very comprehensive. It's very holistic, but also you have to make a judgment call in terms of how much does it align with your company objectives. All it comes down to when you're trying to select a certain, you don't have to be married with a certain framework, but what all it comes down to is like, how do you align that with your company objectives, with your company goals? Because having a framework by itself is not really going to help anyone, including yourself. How do you align with that? And then show, the direction that you want to take, both from a cyber standpoint, and also from a company standpoint, is super helpful. Controls framework, what I've used in the past is the CIS controls. I think they used to have top 20, but now they actually came up with the CIS controls. And I've used that in the past, and I feel comfortable recommending that myself, because there are a few things you want to start off working, and they give a step-by-step guidance on how you want to achieve that. The last one I would say is the behavioral framework when it comes to DevSecOps specifically. A couple. One is the BSIM. This was developed by Synopsys, I believe. And then the other is the OpenSAM. And I'm sure many of you know about OpenSAM. This has been developed by OWASP, and I think it had multiple iterations. So those are a few things I would start with.
Yeah, no, so that's a great outline there for, you have your program and the framework for that, the framework for the controls, and the ones for the behavior. And you said, that it's specifically that BSIM and sort of OpenSAM are especially useful for DevSecOps. I mean, what makes them, I guess, what's different about what you would look for in a framework when you think about, a DevSecOps surrounding versus not?
Yeah, I think maybe let me take a step back and help you kind of understand about how I would approach the whole DevSecOps model or the maturity in general. It all depends on what kind of product and software development life cycles that you have as a company, and how you're building your products, how you're deploying your products, the post-deployment monitoring, things like that, right? You have a engineering team, you have a technology operations, and they do follow certain disciplines and functions. So they should not align with how you're building out, but rather it should be the opposite. So you have to align with theirs. And this is such a great example of what Snyk does, and what you guys do is exactly going there, right? Because you're trying to integrate with the workflows and processes that the dev teams have. And for me, that's been a holy grail. And that's really how I got a lot of things done, like really influencing people on the why, and then trying to pivot my direction towards how the PDLC and SDLC operations really happen.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's all about sort of empathy and I guess adapting to where you want security to be applied. For instance, within development. Is there a difference? I guess you've sort of worked mostly in, I think, these types of sort of fast-paced surrounding, but are there any notable failures, if you will, like things that you tried to apply, says that doesn't seem to be working in this fast surrounding? Oh
man, a lot of failures. I mean, I would 75% failures and maybe 25% successes, I would say. Maybe I'll talk about a few examples. So one is this whole practice about getting closer to the developers or developer ecosystems only happened because I failed the other way. I failed because I was creating my own dashboards. I was asking folks to, work on the security tools that I built out, the processes that I am managing, right? So when you have so many isolations and when you're working in a vacuum, it gets really difficult, not for the people just within your team, but also people who are interacting with you on a day-to-day basis. And our customers, of course, happen to be developers, and at least when you talk about the DevSecOps, and you should be catering to them and really understanding the pain points and the challenges that they are going through. I did not do that, so I can say this loud and clear. I failed on that. This definitely goes back to my service nowadays when I was trying to establish this practice, when I was trying to create the DevSecOps, which is pretty new still. So I think anything that I am trying to take them out of their workable processes or something that they're used to doing and place them in a different channel, you would feel it's going to work for some time, but it's not a long-term accomplishment. You're never going to keep up with that. And there's always going to be something coming up, and there's more friction than actual work that's being done. So that I would say is definitely the biggest one I experienced myself.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great lesson. I think I dove a bit deeper into this rabbit hole. Maybe if we bump up back a little bit and we talk about kind of the different surroundings there of sort of Yext versus collective health, or the more regulated versus less. you have these different frameworks, you have these the desire to adapt to developers. Is that different in the highly regulated? Like, does the same approach work?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think. I'm sure it's different. So, you know how I spoke about like highly regulated industries start off with a premise that you have to comply with certain regulatory obligations. It's not so much more contractual obligations. I'll talk about that in a minute, but more so, what do you need to satisfy to the government or in the legal space before you can start operating as a business? So with that in mind, I think, as soon as as a part of your new hire orientation, it's kind of injected into the employees' minds that this is the bare minimum that we need to have. This is the table stakes, right? So work towards that. So you're not starting at a ground zero when it comes to GRC aspect of it, but I'm not going to say the same thing applies for all the other cyber practices. DevSecOps is a very specialty skill and a very specialty domain that not a lot of people understand exactly the benefits or sometimes not even know how to operate that. At a highest level, people would know, developers or any employee at a company would know, okay, this is what we need to achieve. And this is a checkbox, right? Just like you would do a performance checkbox, you need to do a security checkbox so that you're HIPAA compliant or PCI DSS compliant or FedRAMP compliant, whatever that may be. But that's not really going to take you, to a place where you're secure in your own true nature. So that's one thing I've found. There's a difference in how you approach the discussion, approach the dialogue with the folks when you're in a heavily regulated space versus not. In the product, though, everything happens. The discussions that you would have, you need to lead with the why, right? What's the benefit for me to do this? Everybody wants to do the right thing. That's, it's not that they hate security team. Like, I get this a lot. People feel that security is a policing agent. They're coming in and they're, kind of throwing a bunch of things on our heads and they leave. A lot of effective security leaders don't do that. They're actually the opposite. We enable the teams to do the right work at the right times. At the same time, we want to defend ourselves, from certain things, bad actors, regulators, etc. So in the product side of the house at Yext, at ServiceNow, we talk about the benefits to begin with, and then we showcase what kind of models have we driven to support the case. This could be an enterprise security assessment at the highest level, or bring it down a notch and talk about threat modeling use cases that we came about. And then we kind of drive the discussion downwards. So it's still, in both cases, though, one thing is common. You need to have the executive or board weigh in on the decisions that you're taking as a company when it comes to cyber. And if that doesn't happen, the bottom top approach is never going to work. The top bottom is something you want to start with, and then include the operations and practice at the line manager levels or at the engineer levels, for example.
Yeah, got it. So let me kind of echo this back. So you're saying in a regulated surrounding, achieving the needs for compliance is easier than maybe in an unregulated one, because people are kind of, it's hard coded into people that you have to do X, Y, Z, and they understand. I mean, healthcare, I'm going to worry about it, but it almost makes it by virtue, they need to unlearn that a little bit when they talk about slightly less compliance oriented, just pure security, mindfulness or awareness to security concerns. But either way, whether it's regulated or unregulated, you lead with the why, and just the why is not compliance, or well, sometimes it's compliance, but the why can be a fair bit more. Did I get that correctly?
That's accurate. And also, I'll touch on this. Like, why is a combination of your obligations as a company that you have to meet for your customers and government at the same time, but also your due diligence, right? So what do you as a leader, what do you as a security person want to defend your organization from? Because that technically is how it should start. But unfortunately, we can't have that dialogue without satisfying the first part, because the company leadership is looking for is, how is this going to, enhance my bottom line? How is this going to push my expenditure, revenue for the company? Or however you think about this, like, you have to start with a business mindset and then you go into a technical mindset. But for me, being a technologist myself, like I typically, touch down more on the threat aspect of things, which I shouldn't, which again is another lesson that I've learned recently. So that's those are a few things I would also touch on.
Yeah, for sure. So we'll get back. I'm actually tempted to go to measurement here, but I don't let's put a pin in that and sort of come back to it after. So instead, let's talk people. So we talked, a little bit about sort of the developer engagement, but the security team itself, when you talk about building a team, staffing up for it, what do you look for in a hire? And maybe what are the warning signs, right? What are you looking to avoid, maybe if you're talking about this being different and DevSecOps being a specialized mindset?
Yeah. Even that's a great question, by the way. And I think security's discussion or anything that has to do with cybersecurity right now, it's a niche element in the market, and a lot of people tend to kind of look at this in different ways. My way of thinking about this, you start with the baseline. For me, irrespective of the specialty, you start with a few things. Like for me, you have to have a threat analysis skill set combined with the programming and systems knowledge. Not experience per se, but understanding concepts, right? The basic programming concept, the basic system concepts. Given we're in the cloud first and a microservices architectures right now, you see this more and more now because you're not only dealing with a single layered defense. You're not talking about application by itself. Even though you have an application security engineer, they have to do much more than looking at the application threats. They have to go into Docker, for example. What kind of orchestration services are we running? How is this all combined, and how is this actually pulling it into a threat vector, or what kind of threat landscape are you looking for? So I would say security folks need to have a holistic security coverage, no different than a full stack developer would, right? In the past, we never had a concept of full stack, but now we do, because there's a reason for us to do it. Otherwise, we wouldn't actually build the apps that we're developing right now. So that's the first thing. That's the baseline I would start off with.
Yeah, it's a cool concept. I don't know that I've sort of heard of a full stack security person. It's interesting because you do indeed sort of hear about and I can relate to the dual need of understanding security on one side, but then have some programming mindset or understanding the platform.
Yeah.
How deep do you require going into that programming side? Do you expect people you hire to know how to code? Do you expect them to, show some Terraform proficiency or Kubernetes proficiency? How do you think about weights, if you will, right? In terms of what's more important? Can you teach security more easily than, programming or infrastructure, or vice versa?
Yeah. And also, it shouldn't be, or it's not supposed to be it's a single kind of discipline we're looking for, right? So there are different specialties within security. Security is a pretty broad topic, and we need different people. We need a really good coverage across the realm in terms of how we view these people. They're really strong non-technical people, and there's a really good benefit that we would get out of them. And then there's really strong technical people, but there's a middle ground too. So the way I would think about this is, I think I'm not going to credit myself on this one, but Phil Venables from Google, I think he's a Google Cloud CISO right now. He actually spoke about a model where you combine a few elements of skills within a security group. Like he talks about risk advisors, subject matter experts, and operational analysts. What that means is when you're trying to build a well-rounded security team, you need to have a good combination or a healthy combination of people coming from different disciplines. Think about an application security engineer. What's the easiest way for me to actually have a person come in, hit the ground running, and actually get to the things that I need him or her to do? Coming from a software background is super helpful because it's easier for me to teach them security. Security, in my opinion, and not a lot of people agree with this, but it's more common sense than the actual skill. When I say common sense, I'm not talking just about the technical part of it, but also the people skills, the influential skills. Like when you come in, I talk about this in other discussions too, is when you're thinking about security, you're talking more in terms of not enforcing something, but how do you bring the people along the journey in terms of getting things done? So you're reporting the risk, you're not really executing on it. Somebody else is executing. So you got to influence people to do the right thing. And of course, you got to show the benefits and whatnot. But the way I would position that is, if you're coming from a developer background, it's so much easier for me to teach that element, as opposed to if it's turned down. Like if you're solely on the risk or maybe on threat side of things, for example, you're a security engineer, you've been working on this for a little while, but your focus on programming is so limited, but your role dictates that you need that in order for you to move forward or take the function within the company forward. So I would position the background from software is better. The same thing would apply to network security engineers or cloud security engineers for that matter. You spoke about Terraform, right? What's Terraform? Just a different form of programming. Like you have the concept, you have the fundamentals built in. In the past, I used to have a template just for, object-oriented programming. I used to have just, a few things that I would ask them and, see what kind of expertise do they have in that? And then I would, take on the next threat modeling or whatever the security terminology is there, right? But I would say having a strong skill set in one of the functions that are outside of security and then coming into that, it's much more easier for me to actually teach security for those people.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's consistent with what you've been describing around the tooling. So you have to relate to that tooling, and around the centricity, the idea of you have to align yourself to the model of how the team that you're looking to help secure their work is actually operating. So having the core over there is probably better than coming with the I know what to do, just listen to me starting point, right?
That's the worst. Oh my God. In security, I can't, I think you got to be people smart, right? Otherwise you wouldn't go far, especially in security. And it's true for other fields too. But just given you're trying to make other people work, you got to know how to pull the strings. You got to know how to talk about the right things at the right time. Otherwise it's going to be a broken concept. It wouldn't really, manifest itself into a true benefit, for example.
Yeah. What's if we're like maybe thinking a little bit about tips and tricks, what's a favorite interview question that you have to try and understand people's disposition?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. I think I do have one. So maybe I'm spilling the beans now because everybody listening to this would have the answer ready. One thing I would ask for is to threat model. I wouldn't have a certain scenario in mind. Like I would build up a scenario when I'm talking to this person, like whatever the expertise is, but I would request for specifics when you're performing threat modeling and how that applies to their specific role. So I would start off with the non-technical aspect of threat modeling and then go into technical aspect. This is, for me to assess the thought process on how people think about security. The reason for that is it's a certain skill in terms of how you put the thought into practice when you come to security, right? Everybody can think about security, right? But how do you carry that torch to a place where you're not only identifying the issues, but also making sure you do have the right defenses in place? And this is where, thinking out of the box comes into play, because academically you've thought about, you're taught to, if there's a cross-site scripting, okay, what's the fix? Whitelisting or escaping. But that's not the reality, right? Reality comes in multiple forms, and sometimes you don't even have an answer. So how do you kind of adapt and course correct depending on, what kind of situation you're faced in? So that's what really blends between the non-technical to technical aspect of threat modeling. So that is something I've had much success in the past, and kind of differentiating between the successful candidate versus an unsuccessful candidate.
No, it's great. And I don't think you're sort of hiding anything, because I think the beauty of such a question is that it's broad enough that it shows you how people are doing it. When I was a CTO at Akamai, I was in sort of the web space, and one of my favorite questions was, you open a browser, you put a URL and you hit enter, and a web page shows up. What happened in the process? And then people will take it down. Some people would break down more the rendering of the web page. Some would be more network minded. Some would kind of describe more high level. Some would go low level. So it oftentimes actually these types of open-ended questions are useful to just sort of show where people bias, right? Where they.
I like that. That's really nice question to ask for sure.
So we're kind of starting to run out of time a little bit here. I do want to sort of talk a little bit. We talked about, the methodologies and the frameworks. We talked about people and some of the hiring. Let's talk KPIs and measurement. So a lot of different activities here, choices, frameworks, hiring. How do you know if you're doing it correctly? What do you use to measure the success of yourself, of your team, of the program?
Yeah. Oh, Guy, you just opened a can of worms now. The KPIs, and it's a never-ending dialogue when you come to security, right? Because you're always faced with the questions about what's the return on investment when I'm trying to sign this off for you. And I'm just going to say this, right? There's no one size fits all. We have to tailor the metrics, the telemetry, whatever the KPIs or key risk indicators. Now, whether some of the leaders call it, it really depends on how you're trying to build the program out, and how do you see yourself accomplishing that. So a few things. Ultimately, it boils down to, what do your customers need from you? What does the government need from you? And what do you yourself need from the program? right? So I would focus on those three elements to begin with and let that be a guiding pathway to build out your respective KPIs. So a few things that work for me, I'm just going to talk about my experience. Governance metrics, right? So when you have a GRC program, like you gotta focus on at the highest levels, how are you trying to define a program and how do you show the success or the pathways that you're taking in order to be successful? So basic expected controls conformance, for example, patching, identity and access, configuration assurance, any deviations that you captured. This could be quantifiable. This could be quality related. It really depends on how you're building the program out or how specific do you want to get the information out. There's also the audience, right? So are you conveying this information to board, executive team? Then it of course has to cater to that audience. So which means it has to be at the highest levels and you don't go into specifics. But if you have an ISOC, like, for example, a charter committee or something where you have a group of people taking decisions in terms of, what security means to the company, you have a different way of approaching that. So, and then there's also, service and asset risk oriented metrics. The way I would think about this is how the measurement of risk to specific groups of assets or business services in relation to maybe attacker motivation or attacker capabilities. The examples or, some of the factors you could use here would be the layers of complementary defense from an attacker to a target. Degree of pressure on controls, for example, like, are you making it difficult for an attacker, even after they compromise the first layer of defense, to come and, get to the final target, the dwell time, things like these. Also, what you could also do is, have simulation exercises, and not every team would actually have the realistic metrics. You can always do simulations and figure out, how these metrics kind of evolve and how they manifest themselves. The last thing I'll talk about, which typically is most important for, many of the companies, is the commercial outcomes and also the competitive advantage that you have when you compare yourself with others in the same market space, right? So what direct or adjacent benefits are expected in addition to loss avoidance, for example, risk reductions, security outcomes, right? So a few factors that you can think about is maybe the customer sign-up rates due to like seamless authentication processes that you have as a product feature, or maybe increased collaboration and support, of customers or reduction of employee overhead, or maybe time spent in managing controls too, because every time you build a control, there's an operational life cycle for that. So if you're trying to reduce that and still be able to optimize it, that's a great metric to talk about.
Yeah, and for this last one, is it around measuring the avoidance of something? So
yeah,
when we think about the authentication, do you mean here, you assume some maybe baseline of what's bad, or like maybe what's the norm, and you're trying to kind of measure how far away are you from it? Just trying to understand.
Yeah, kind of. So it's twofold, right? So one is, what are the table stakes for you when you're trying to define the security controls for your customer space? What is it different between yourself and your competitor? Are you making it easier for people to bootstrap security principles or controls as a part of your product, or are you making it difficult for them to actually go through that journey? In some cases, it has to be secure defaults, right? No questions asked, you're going to get this by default. You don't have to lift a finger. But in some cases, it's much more complicated than that. You have to have a customer action before you could actually manifest the benefit of a security control. So that's where I would think that's one part. And the other part is also, how do you manage your own workforce from a security standpoint on managing or pushing these patches or security features out? Are you trying to reduce the unit cost of a control? If you're doing that successfully, that means you're actually going in the right direction, because when you start off with the control, right, it's going to take a while before it can start providing benefits, or you can reap the benefits off of it. But over time, if you're doing the right things, it would be more of an automated enforcement. Like things you're building out, the investment that you put in, the expense that you put in is actually going to come down. So those are a few things I would say that speaks volumes to how you're building the program.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it's interesting. And you're right that it's a kind of worms here. could have probably sort of, gone deep on each one of these elements. But I think, it's a great overview of the different types of KPIs that you would have. Clearly, oftentimes, the challenge is consolidating them. Maybe squeeze one final questions on this before we, I ask you my typical closing question here. So you in passing there sort of said there's KPI when you said, well, but there's also key risk indicators. When you're in a security leadership role, do you see the two as the same? Like is the KRI, I guess I haven't actually sort of seen it in acronym form, but is a KRI the same as a KPI?
I wouldn't say that. Some people do inflate them together, but for me, I treat them separate. Performance, in my opinion, is trying to build elements within the program and trying to look at what that accomplishment looks like and then derive the metrics off of it. A good example would be, let's say we're trying to build a single sign-on. That's a performance metric, clearly, because you're building a project. Yes, there's a risk you're trying to address, but more importantly for me, the direction is more important than what we're trying to address when you talk about the KPI. The KRI, on the other hand, and you're right, it is called KRIs, the risk on how you talk, or maybe even the best way to position that is, let's say you have a top 10 or top 5 risk that you're trying to present to your board. Those happen to be the highest level of KRIs. Each KRI can have multiple KPIs, but not the other way around. So risk is something you're trying to address. And what kind of KPIs are you trying to perform or trying to retrieve? So you're actually trying to address that key risk indicator, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the performance is really around the execution towards reduction of risk.
Yes, good way to put it.
Rohit, this is, it's like broad and we have so many topics to do it, but, we kind of ran out of time. So before I let you go here, one final question that I like to ask, all guests coming on the show. So if you imagine someone sitting in your seat 5 years from now, not necessarily in your company and more like, your type of role, what would be most different about their reality? What would be higher, lower, harder, easier? What most different?
Oh man, that's a tough one. There's so many things I can talk about, and I'll just maybe talk about a few things. I think inflation, I think we spoke about this a little while ago, the security staffing. Right now, there's a lot of demand for security folks. Supply, not so much, right? So which is why it's getting really difficult for us to find quality security engineers. And when I say quality, I talked about all the attributes that go into a quality engineer. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. Finding quality engineers is a difficult task. And I think the inflation of these specialties in general for cybersecurity is only going to grow, both from a role diversity standpoint. And also, you see this now, the proliferation of solutions that are out in the market for cybersecurity are growing in size. So I think that's going to keep growing. I'm not sure what the upper limit is going to be, but I think the person sitting in this position 5 years from now has to navigate through all this noise, weed out what exactly they need to have in order to build the program out, mature the program out, maintain the program, whatever that may be, rather than leading with the shiny or the beautiful thing out there. I'm not saying everybody does that, but it's easy for us to look at what's new. We already have a solution in place, but there's a new one that's, cutting edge and something we want to implement. So it's easy for us to take that and refactor that in, but not a lot of people think about the total cost of operations when you do that. Migration cost, deployment cost, it just adds up. And on one hand, and no offense to the vendors out there, but you have vendors pushing you towards, these solutions that are out there and like, yeah, this solution is better than this one. Please consider this. You do a POC, you do a POE, and then end up doing that, but you fail to see what's really at the long term. So that's one thing I feel is kind of, something that's only going to grow in size, and you have to have, a critical thought process put into before you start establishing something. I, for one, don't like shelfware. If I'm using something, I'll make sure we squeeze every penny out of it before I go to the next one. But that's just me. But I feel that space is definitely going to go more complicated and inflated.
Yeah. Sounds like basically the fragmentation, and that aligns with, I guess, what we've seen with DevOps and to an extent with decentralization that, all of these motions are causing. You have a lot of teams will pick different tools. They will need different tools for it. And that's a reality that I can say that the DevOps world is thrilled with it, but has kind of made peace with it and maybe learns to accept it a bit more. So I guess security would be facing that as well. Rohit, this has been great. Thanks a lot for coming onto the show.
Of course. Yeah, it's been really fun, and thanks for all the beautiful questions.
And thanks everybody for tuning in, and I hope you join us for the next one.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at DevSecOps. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.